I managed to get out, and the next thing I was aware of was a burning pain in my side. I looked down and I saw fresh tissue from an obvious wound.
He was bleeding pretty badly.
I thought, oh shit, please, survive, John, please.
We need to go inside, It's locked. Motherfucker.
They tell me there's one bunker, and then if shelling starts, to go over to that bunker door, and then I go over to the door and it's locked. The one instruction I was given, and it didn't protect me.
И, я сижу и понимаю, что, сидеть толку нет, потому что прилетит, если в эту штуку, где мы прятались, может попасть и в окно, не дай бог, или там возле двери попадет, что осколками всех зацепит.
Все сюда! Быстро! Быстро броневик все! Все бегут!
On June 6, 2023, the Novokakhovka Dam in Ukraine's Kherson region was destroyed, causing massive flooding to the communities downstream. The deluge of water emptied out of the reservoir before submerging villages close to the Dnipro River. This put an estimated 42,000 people at risk, while trapping and killing those caught in the floodwaters who couldn't get out of the way in time. This necessitated a rescue operation, many of which were hastily organized, with volunteers coming from across Ukraine to assist. Offbeat Research correspondent Dylan Burns was on the scene to document rescue efforts.
It was pretty bad in Kherson due to the flooding, so me and Alex Bardaway from New Voice of Ukraine wanted to head down there so we could film the rescue operations. We didn't really prepare any big plan. We didn't have a lot of embeds. We just wanted to head down there and film whatever we could. We almost didn't get into the city. They were very, very aggressive about safety going in. It was the first time I'd ever interacted with a checkpoint guard, and they had actively checked my body armor and helmet before entering the city. It was the first time, and I had gone to forward operating positions with the army, so I knew it was going to be pretty serious.
While in Kherson, Dylan Burns embedded with a German rescue team called Four Paws Rescue. It was made up of Robin Heller, Johannes Hinterseer, and Timo Baumeister. Their purpose for being in Kherson was to help rescue animals that could have been trapped by the flooding, with the Ukrainian environmental minister Ruslan Strilets saying that as many as 20,000 animals might have died in the flooding.
They were just like near a hostel we were staying at, and we saw them with the rescue gear and all with the vans with the logos on it. So we walked up, we started talking to them. They knew English, and from there we grew it into an embed. We got very lucky that they would allow us to film with them, and they were very interested in making sure that everything's documented, which in this instance, thank goodness that there were some cameras rolling.
Dylan Burns and the Four Paws crew were also joined by British expat volunteer John Jones, who had come to Kherson on his own initiative in order to help out wherever he could, like assisting Ukrainian animal welfare NGO UA Animals in establishing a pop-up animal shelter in an abandoned building in the city. On June 14th, the Four Paws rescue team, along with John Jones, Alex Bartway and Dylan Burns, headed towards a rendezvous point where they planned to meet other aid workers, including Mitya Harfuch and her colleagues at Christian aid charity House of Hope, before heading out on the Dnipro River to perform rescue operations. At this point though, they were already off to a rough start. The combination of chaotic coordination and new safety requirements for boats that required the Germans to get a boat from a local coordinator meant they were only ready to get out on the water past 6 p.m, much later than they preferred.
It wasn't very centralized, and it led to a lot of the response being very chaotic. And I think this was most clearly shown by the fact that the Germans, who got a red rescue boat from a local coordinator because the requirements for what boats you could take out the water had changed and they had to get a metal, stronger boat than the one they had on hand, they took it out to water and it didn't work. And after a conversation with somebody else, they led me to believe that they had also interacted with that boat and they had reported to somebody that it wasn't working. And so just that miscommunication could have possibly contributed to this tragedy. So this type of chaotic response was not the best environment. People did what they could on such short notice.
They were also informed that the Russians had been shelling in the area the day before, but after other aid workers came back from the river, and said it was relatively quiet on the water, they felt encouraged.
The team was somewhat divided on whether they were going to go out into the water or not. It was already getting pretty late, and there was already so many delays and people were kind of frustrated. Not to mention there were reports of shelling in the area the day before, so some people felt an obvious safety concern being so close to the Russians. But then a rescue team came back from the shoreline and they gave a story of, it's quite peaceful in the water today. It's very nice, it's very tranquil, it's relatively safe. And that might have been true for them, but obviously that was not true for us. But that was enough to convince them to keep going ahead.
The team went down from the rendezvous point to the shoreline and launched the boat into the water with Robin, Johannes and John inside. John was helping drive the boat due to his previous experience, but as they began to run into engine troubles soon after it in the water, the team quickly had to pull out paddles. While they started to run into engine issues, Dylan, Alex and Timo went back to the rendezvous point, not wanting to crowd the muddy shoreline with Russian positions only a few kilometers away.
I knew something was wrong when they took out a paddle for the speedboat, because that's not how speedboats are supposed to work. But at that point, they were getting help from another person out, another boat that was out on the water, a white boat full of locals. And I was called back to the Jeep because they didn't want people to gather on the shoreline due to risk of shelling, wouldn't you know it?
Even after those three left, the boat crew still couldn't get the boat running, even with the assistance of other volunteer crew. After multiple more failed attempts to get the engine started, the decision was made to head back to the shoreline, since they were unable to complete the rescue work safely without a functioning engine. Once back on the shore, a call was made for Timo, Alex and Dylan to come pick them up and help them bring the boat back. It was after the call wrapped up when the crew started to drag the boat onto the shore at exactly 6:49 PM local time that the barrage began.
So then they called him on the walkie-talkie that there's a problem with the boat and he's gonna drive down with the car, and on the way the mortar attack came in.
Suddenly, for a brief moment, a distant boom could be heard, immediately followed by the unmistakable whistle of an incoming shell. Thinking fast, Johannes immediately threw himself to the ground to take cover upon hearing the screech of the shell, just in time for it to make impact near the coast. Robin and Johannes then ran to a bunker near the shore, along with other aid and rescue workers, with the mud swallowing their legs as they tried to traverse the shoreline, working against them and slowing their escape as the shelling continued.
When we started running, I think I slipped and fell on the ground. I'm not sure I think it must have been after the first hit. And this was the first time Johannes turnn around and took like 2, 3 or 4 steps maybe back to my position, helped me up, and then we ran together, basically holding hands that nobody slipped again.
Nearly a dozen aid workers had attempted to take shelter in the bunker, more than it was built to hold, with some people trying their best to squeeze into the tight space as the rescue operation was continuously targeted by artillery. During this chaos, John Jones had been hit by shrapnel from a Russian shell while standing next to the rescue boat. This caused shrapnel to penetrate both his upper thigh and lower abdomen, injuring and immobilizing him on the shore.
I heard the first shell explode. It seemed to me to be somewhere behind me. People, of course, went looking for cover, but I was stuck in the mud on the Dnipro. I was wearing hiking boots, which were full of mud, and I couldn't really move very fast. So I managed to get out, and the next thing I was aware of was another shell explosion and a burning pain in my side. I looked down and I saw fresh tissue from an obvious wound, and moments after that I collapsed on the floor.
While the shoreline was being bombed, those at the rendezvous point were scrambling for cover. When Dylan Burns heard the familiar whistle of an incoming shell, he also threw himself to the ground and headed to the door of a bunker that local police told him to use if they came under fire. But it didn't go as planned.
We need to go inside. It's locked. Motherfucker. Why would they lock the door?
Eventually, after the majority of shelling had already concluded, someone inside opened the rear entrance to let the three in. Back at the shoreline, volunteers taking cover in the bunker, like Dmytro and Nazarchik, were attempting to get to John, who was still injured and lying in the mud on the shore.
И потом, ну, обстрел там, они потихонечку кидают, и, ну, я сижу и понимаю, что, ну, сидеть толку нет, потому что прилетит, если в эту штуку, ну, где мы прятались, и мы начинаем пытаться выходить, и постоянно выход, ну, взрыв, и мы его раз 5 пытались достать, и у нас не получалось, но это на видео даже есть, там видео. И мы его раз 5 пытались, не могли достать, потому что, ну, постоянно кидают.
The Germans and the Ukrainians came in a large number, I forget how many, and they ran out and picked me up and carried me to a nearby cylindrical bunker that couldn't fit us all. They shoved me in, and everybody else tried to pile in.
I saw in his face that it's really critical because he get like a little bit slippery and his circulation was not the best, and I thought, oh shit, please survive, John, please.
The volunteer who had been hit. He was hit in his stomach and in his leg, and he was bleeding pretty badly. And they continued to shell us, I think, maybe 5 or 6 more times. And as the other guys were taking the one who had been hit, were carrying him to the shelter, they continued to fire at them.
Eventually, though, under fire, local volunteers were able to make their way to John and carry him back to the bunker on the shore. While John now had cover, his wounds were clearly serious, especially the shrapnel wound in his lower stomach. As the shelling continued, a discussion ensued as to whether they should remain in the bunker or run to a nearby van and flee the area. But the volunteers wanted to get John to a hospital as quickly as possible and ultimately made the decision to get out of there.
И потом его уже в легковую мы закинули, слава богу, там с Херсона волонтеры тоже такие живчики, ну, которые не, ну, шевелятся. И мы закинули раненого в легковую машину и отправили его в госпиталь. И потом сидим дальше в этом же укрытии, ну, и надо действовать. Я говорю, я так, ну, всех проверил, чтобы не было ни у кого шока, ну, чтобы не было остепенения. Посмотрел, ни у кого шока нету, говорю, все, я за броневиком. Выбегаю под обстрелами за броневиком, запрыгиваю в броневик, разворачиваюсь, ну там с проблемами, там поломал двигатель свой, ну переехал моторный. Представьте, обстрел идет уже, там ни о чем не думаешь. И подгоняю броневик и зову всех ребят, всех, кто там был, и мы начинаем выезжать. Ну и когда едешь в броневике, там не слышишь особо выстрелов, но ехали быстро.
As John was driven to the hospital, the German aid workers were driven back to the rendezvous point, where they were able to reunite with Dylan, Timo and Alex, before finally driving back to safety after a lull in the shelling.
After the shelling, we basically decided to get out of the city as fast as possible, mostly because of mental reasons, I guess.
John would be treated that night at a local Kherson hospital, where doctors discovered that his pelvis stopped the shrapnel in his lower abdomen, which likely saved him.
I was lucky in many ways. The shell fragment, the shrapnel, entered cleanly through my belly, around the area of my navel, at an oblique angle, and passed under the layer of muscle and tissue, then struck the edge of my pelvis and was deflected out of my body. Again, a clean entry and exit wound.
The next day, while everyone was still rattled by the previous day's events, Dylan and Alex were visiting John in the hospital when Dylan was texted a video.
Me and Alex, by the way, went to the hospital to visit John. He was pretty messed up, but he was in safe condition. And when we were talking to him and about to head out from the hospital, I get a text message from my buddy, from my good friend in Kiev. And it's a video that was very obviously the boat that we were using the day before, the red boat. And there was the white boat next to it, and it was on the exact shoreline. It was us, that was us, the aid workers on the shoreline. And it was from the perspective of a Russian drone with a rune often used by the Nazis in the top left-hand corner. And they were playing rock music as they shelled us on video. And then they posted this online with a message about us being special forces trying to build a bridgehead on the other side of the river. It was absolutely ridiculous. It was surreal. It was kind of hard to process. It was probably the most shocking part of the entire trip.
The video in question was posted on the Disgusting 8 Telegram channel, the social media channel for drone and artillery support elements attached to the Levadia Battalion, a private military company owned by Sergei Aksyonov. Aksyonov is the head of the Crimean Occupation Authority and was installed in 2014 after Russian forces invaded and occupied the Crimean Regional Parliament building. Aksyonov's Levada Battalion are officially designated as reservists and formalized as the 30th Combat Army Reserve. The group also cooperates with the Russian Army's 150th Motorized Rifle Division and 205th Separate Motor Rifle Brigade. Members of the Levada Battalion were made to sign a contract with the Russian Ministry of Defense under the Combat Army Reserve program, and with PMC Convoy, a company consisting of reconnaissance and assault units led by Wagnerite Konstantin Pikolov. This isn't the first time Russia has shelled civilians and aid workers in Kherson during rescue operations. Less than 48 hours after the dam was destroyed, the Russians began to shell the city of Kherson as rescue operations were still intermittently underway, posing a danger to local aid workers. In one incident, Moshe Reuven Azman, the chief rabbi of Ukraine, and his team were shelled during an aid work operation in the city. Additional reports from Ukrainian government of the direct targeting of rescue workers, similar to what we have documented, has resulted in the deaths of both local civilians and foreign aid workers. To get a better understanding of war crimes like the targeting of civilians and rescue workers in the city, we talked to an international human rights lawyer and specialist in international humanitarian law.
So my name is Sarah Kay. I'm an international human rights lawyer. I specialize in national security and specifically hybrid warfare. And as the bodies of law emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War, we saw protection of civilians extend to specifically protected professions. And this protected profession is usually human rights defenders, journalists, such as yourselves, and anyone that works in a humanitarian capacity. So it's a violation of the laws of war, specifically through the principle of neutrality that is applying to international humanitarian law. That is the ideal that we have drafted at that time, is that if you are visibly a humanitarian worker or providing humanitarian assistance, you cannot be targeted.